with MESEO, we are designing, prototyping and demonstrating a digital ecosystem to attempt to improve performance in each of the different steps in the satellite data processing chain. At our last webinar, for those of you that were here, we went through the different elements of this MESEO system. But today, we want to share a bit more about how we hope that this system could work on the ground. So in the final MESEO system, an end user would be able to request specific data, and the central coordination system would assess the request and activate a function that can provide data in the most appropriate form. We demonstrate this in our project by testing data requests on 2 use cases related to environmental challenges. One is crop classification and the other is monitoring of methane emissions. And our focus today is that latter one, methane emissions, which is an essential part of climate monitoring. We have here today Wazim Azami to tell us all about it. Wazim is a data scientist at Sistema, another partner of the MESEO project, and also an Austrian-based company which is developing tools that use geospatial data to deal with various environmental challenges. So he's well placed to talk to us about this topic, and he's going to explain to us how MESEO combines traditional satellite-based and IA-driven technologies to monitor methane emissions over time and to generate accurate data. The presentation will last around 30 minutes. You can write your questions on the chat and we'll deal with them in the Q&A session after Wazim's presentation. The chat function, I hope, allows you to either write just to the organisers or speakers, or even better, you can send them to everyone so the audience can see your questions too. That is all from me, and I would like to welcome Wazim, and it's great to have you here, and I would pass the floor over to you to start your presentation.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks everyone for joining our webinar today about methane emissions, integrating satellites, AI, and traditional methods. So today we'll go through this agenda. First, I will briefly introduce again MESEO as a project. Then we can go directly into the main subject, being methane and its climate impact, the methodologies and their outputs, next steps, and finally conclude. So, MESEO stands for Multi-Mission Efficient and Secure High-Capacity End-to-End Earth Observation. And as you might understand from the name, its objective is clear. Is to design, prototype, and demonstrate an open, flexible, scalable multi-mission Earth observation end-to-end system for satellite data processing, while also ensuring space data sovereignty. And in an upcoming slide, I will show you how MESEO has planned its different elements with this objective in mind. But first, let me introduce our partners that work in different parts of the project. So the project has a space segment and the ground segment. For the space segment, we have Satlantis and Robotica and Cryotech working on the payload satellite ground platform. GMV takes care of the system engineering, space data service provisioning, while also leading the project. Airbus is working on the system interfaces, standardization, and security. Solvity takes care of the ground data transfer and infrastructure, while us at Sistema and University of Ferrara work on use cases for the Iridian application. As mentioned by Jessica, here we are going to talk about methane monitoring, but University of Ferrara is also working on the crop classification. And finally, Resolvo here with us today takes care of the communication and dissemination and exploitation. And not to forget the advisory board, which is a group of experts and then users that we work with to discuss and take feedback from. So let's take a look at the end-to-end setup that we have in MESEO. And as you can tell, MESEO has both the space and ground segment integrated. On the space side, we have Satlantis being the payload provider, Robotica working with the coprocessor, and Cryotech with the platform. All three together are working on optimization in terms of data handling and data storage, while also using AI for pre-processing on board already before doing the data transfer on ground. These data transfers and each movement of the data actually goes through connectors from Solvity, our partner, that ensures the data sovereignty. And then this data goes to the ground processing function, where we enhance its quality and produce outputs that are ready to use by the use case processors, but not final. And then in the Earth Observation Coordination Center, here we create the final output depending on the user request, either methane processor outputs or crop classification outputs that are provided then to the user. So today we are focusing on this small part of the end-to-end being the methane processor. So why is methane important? Let's see. So methane, as we all know, is part of the greenhouse gases, and its concentration in the atmosphere is now over 2.5 times greater than in pre-industrial levels. Its effect is also much more potent than CO2, where some studies put it up to 82 times more potent in a period of 20 years. And as you can see in the slide, for the past 30 to 35 years, the concentration in the atmosphere has been only rising year by year. And in the blue line, we can see that in all of this period, there has been only 3 years where the annual change has been negative, or we've seen a decrease in atmospheric methane concentrations. But what is interesting to keep in mind is the fact that methane has a perturbation life of only 12.4 years, whereas CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for much longer. So, what causes these higher and higher methane concentrations? In the left graph, you can see that the main sectors that are responsible for the methane concentrations are agriculture, and then the energy sector and waste. While on the right graph, there is the International Energy Agency reports that the energy sector actually is responsible that is responsible for 1/3 of the emissions, presents one of the biggest opportunities for abatement, showing that we can potentially reduce these emissions by 80 million tons by 2030. And as mentioned earlier, the lifespan of methane in the atmosphere is very short relative to CO2, so the effects of such abatements would be seen in the short term. Well, let's investigate. The IEA, International Energy Agency, reports that the countries with the most emissions in the oil and gas production in 2023 have been these in the graph here: the United States, Russia, Iran, Turkmenistan, and so forth. But what is also interesting in this graph is the orange dots, which showcase the intensity, which means the amount of methane emitted by unit of energy created. Where here we can see that Turkmenistan is basically the least efficient in terms of creating energy. High intensity values can be a result of methane leaks in old pipelines, bad venting practices, etc. And this is an important metric because it could indicate places where there could be a significant reduction of methane emissions while we are not reducing much our energy production levels. So this takes us to different statistics by the UNEP, which reports that the number of methane plumes detected by satellites per country in 2024, where Turkmenistan leads by far. In fact, you can see on the graphic on the right side of the slide that only a few countries are responsible for the large majority of the methane emissions that are detected with satellites. And all of this information is pretty useful when we get to the technical side of monitoring methane, because it's difficult to know exactly where to look when monitoring methane. It's if we don't start with a foundation of information of where to look, where to try to monitor methane, we would not know how to look or where to look, or at least would have to deal with huge amounts of data that we don't want to be dealing with. So enough with the statistics. Let's start with the methodology. So we are talking about methane, but this is the same way that all greenhouse gases in general impact temperature. So the sun radiates sunlight that is visible to us, but also infrared radiations that we cannot see. These are reflected by the Earth's surface, and the long-wave radiations seek to leave the atmosphere, but are blocked by these greenhouse gases, including methane, CO2, etc. But almost all of it is absorbed by the greenhouse gases. So these gases would re-radiate the absorbed energy, and this would actually create the warming effect. That is the greenhouse gas effect. And while we cannot see gases like methane with the naked eye, infrared sensors can see these gases, and that's why they are implemented in different ways, also in satellites, to help us try to visualize these gases and try to monitor them. So methane monitoring can be done in different scales. As mentioned before, sensors can be used in different ways, in different places. We can maybe split them into three groups. There is the ground sensors with high precision for site-specific monitoring, like cameras that are specific for one point source or one site. And then there is drones or planes that can be used to monitor larger areas, like oil rigs, etc. And then in our case, satellites that are global or regional for monitoring. There's satellites that can have global scale monitoring, different pixel sizes, etc. And this creates a difference between satellites themselves. So satellites have different capabilities for methane monitoring in terms of temporal resolution, spatial resolution, and also availability. Because there is satellites that provide data and are public missions like Tropomi or Sentinel-5, Landsat 8, Landsat 9, Sentinel-3 and Sentinel-2, etc. These are just some examples that have data that is available for everybody, and everybody could use this data, but also with some processing, because the data is not specific for methane monitoring. But we could process this data and have some methane products. But there's also private and commercial missions that sometimes provide directly methane product, and some example would be GHGSat or JSat, which is the satellite provided by Satlantis that is part of the MESEO consortium. So a little bit more technical. Let's go deeper in the methodology. So now I will maybe delve into the traditional method case study specifically for Sentinel-2. As a reference, the reason why Sentinel-2 is used in methane monitoring is because of two specific bands that are part of the images provided by the satellite that are in the shortwave infrared spectrum. It's band 12 and band 11. In this graph, you can see the absorption lines for CH4, CO2, and H2O, but let's focus on the black lines for CH4. If you can see the grayed areas, those represent band 12 and band 11 for Sentinel-2. And you can see that band 12 covers more high absorption lines for CH4 specifically compared to band 11. These two bands are also close enough to each other so that whenever we have an image, the values for the backgrounds in band 12 and the background in band 11 are different, but not so different that we could maybe do an analysis and compare between the two bands to try and visualize the difference that would be the visibility of methane in band 12 versus the low visibility of methane in band 11. And if we go further, we can use a bitemporal analysis in this case with Sentinel-2, where we choose to get also a reference image that has no methane emissions, and comparing one image that has a methane emission, both band 11 and 12, with the reference image, we can actually end up with a more clear result. And in the next slide, I will maybe explain. In the left side is the example where we do a multi-band single pass method, where it's only one image, but we use both bands 11 and 12. And you can see the examples here are both in Algeria, a region called Hassi Massoud in 2019. Two different dates, but In a darker color in the center of the image, here are methane emissions that are from a leak in a pipeline. But the use of only one image introduces an issue where also the background could look like methane emissions, or we could not differentiate between a methane emission and the background, specifically if we don't have extra information like the location of oil and gas infrastructure, pipelines, etc. So the multi-band, multi-pass method on the right side solves this issue by introducing a reference image that is temporarily close. So 2-3 weeks maybe difference between the two images, so we don't introduce a lot of change in the background. And then the methane emissions are a lot clearer, and we can isolate them pretty well and see where they come from, and give the methane emission to its proper source location. But this is not enough, because now we can see a methane emission, but what is important also is to estimate how much methane is leaking from these emissions. And this is also part of the traditional methodology, where the most commonly used method is called integrated methane enhancement, IME, where emission rate is correlated to the multi-band, multi-pass product we mentioned earlier, the area covered by the methane plume, and the wind speed. So 3 variables, which means that the proper isolation of methane plumes is important, since it's a parameter in this calculation. And the most common way is done is just through basic filtering and smoothing the image, which in cases like this is not problematic, but sometimes where the backgrounds are pretty complex, or there is a water body, stuff like that, it's the basic filtering and smoothing could fall short. And here is an example in Turkmenistan in 2022, where the isolation of the plume makes it clear if we overlay it, of course, on Google Maps. We can see exactly where the methane leak is coming from, and we can attribute it to the company or the responsible entity. So next is in methodology overview, of course. We're going to talk about the AI models. There's a number of studies that came out using different models to detect methane emissions, of course with pros and cons, but I will go through a collection of common points. So the models use vision transformers and unit architectures. And in this methodology, there is a huge need for data. AI models need big amounts of data and manual labeling of this data, and you cannot, like the traditional method, use only one image or 2 images and then end up with a result. This is mainly because there is first no ground truth. So company or responsible of emitting methane would not report their methane emissions in terms of quantity and location. So there is no actual ground truth, and it's pretty expensive to create ground truth. No, but to create ground truth, you would need to emit methane, and it's not a proper way to do it. So this raises a solution of using simulated methane emissions. So we would take a satellite image and overlay a simulated methane emission over it. And this could be through a physically robust model that is very accurate to reality, but needs big computation power, like a large eddy simulation. But there's also studies that use simpler approaches and report good results of data sets using Sentinel-2 and also simple simulation methods. And with all that being said, there is still a need for the traditional methodology for us to be able to see these methane emissions and label them and confirm that an image has the methane emission. we still have to compute the multi-band, multi-pass image, for example, and see and confirm that there is a methane emission while labeling the data. And the image here is an example of a study that created the dataset for methane detection. And unless you have the multi-band, multi-pass image for each patch, you would not be able to confirm if there is a methane emission there or not. While you could also use extra information like oil and gas infrastructure and stuff like that, but multi-band, multi-pass traditional methodology is still needed. So where does MESEO, our project, stand in all of this? What we've already created and implemented, because the project is of course still ongoing, but in our first testing environment, we implemented a version of the traditional method integrated in the end-to-end, but with some modification, of course. We developed a new algorithm for cleaner plume isolation, because the isolation, as I said before, is an important aspect of the detection. And the robust approach can be helpful in labeling the AI training data, which is also part of the work that we are doing in MESEO. There is a huge part of this methane monitoring issue that has to do with the data and getting the data, collecting it, structuring it, etc. So as I described in the end-to-end earlier, let's take the methane case for now. The diagram here represents the steps that are triggered after the orchestrator has received information from the user and has input data available. So the images, satellite images, are already available in archive. Then this data is first retrieved, the multi-band, multi-pass image is created, and methane isolation is done. And with that, a final output would be compiled and ready to send to the user. This output would then be, in our case, a 3-band raster with the multi-band, multi-pass image, an isolated methane image, and a mask containing information about the methane leak. But we are still, as I said, in the middle of the project. So what has also been done is work on the simulated data for Sentinel-2 specifically, because again, Sentinel-2 is one of the best choices in terms of publicly available satellite imagery to use for methane detection due to its spatial resolution. So we choose the simple Gaussian dispersion approach for its benefits. These large eddy simulations, as mentioned, are pretty heavy in terms of computation. So we use different images with the different wind conditions of dispersion. We use randomized point sources location and diverse background, and this is to avoid having a dataset that has a lot of images that are similar to each other, and then it creates issues while training the AI models. And of course, this work is to lay the ground for the next steps. And that being the implementation of AI models in combination with the traditional method, the traditional approach. Because the traditional approach, mainly multi-band, multi-pass, lays the ground for making the dataset that by itself is used to train the models. So traditional approach is still going to be part of the workflow. Second is to assess the improvements in statistics. We plan to compare how the traditional model that we already have implemented compares to an AI model or multiple iterations of the AI model, and see how much of an improvement that could be. One improvement that could be beneficial is the fact that AI models would potentially use only one image, so there would not be a need for a reference image, as per some studies that have already trained some AI models. And then we also do some internal demonstrations in test environments. And finally, we want to implement the JSAT data from our partner in the workflow. Because for now, the focus has been on Sentinel-2, because Sentinel-2 has a quite big archive of data. So we can access a lot of data that is needed for AI, while for JSAT, it's more difficult. But it is in the plans that we want to use JSAT data for methane monitoring. So Finally, for the conclusion, methane is responsible for 30% of the warming, and oil and gas sector contributes with 80 million tons per year that can be reduced. Another benefit or reason for the focus on the oil and gas industry is the fact that there is publicly available datasets of the oil and gas industry infrastructure, and that helps a lot while collecting data and while also confirming the existence of a methane leak in an image. There is also the benefit of short atmospheric lifetime of methane, which means that dealing with these emissions and reducing them would have an immediate climate benefit from the reduction, unlike dealing with CO2 emissions. Second is the capability, because satellites provide a huge benefit of being both global but also local at the same time, because the images are global in a sense, but the spatial resolution makes it that it is possible to detect methane locally, both with the AI-driven and traditional methods, which both are proven and can be used to give proper outputs. And finally, for our project, our position as MESEO, we as MESEO combine all the elements of the end-to-end. So we have the elements starting from the satellite acquiring an image up to a final image that is specific for a use case like methane. And the structure is set so that we can host multiple missions and use cases leveraging both AI on ground and on board with the satellite. And finally, we try to have in our multi-mission outputs user-friendly images or outputs that can be easily understood by any user, and also have the benefit of them being per request. So users can request a specific area of interest, a specific time, and we will try to provide outputs that are relevant to that request. And yeah, that's it. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you to you, Wazim, for taking the time to tell us about MESEO and about this specific focus about how we can support this use case of methane monitoring. I am about to open the question and answer session. Just before I do, just a reminder that, as we said at the beginning, MESEO is a project that's funded by the European Commission, and it's what they call an innovation action. So this means that it's a collaborative research project. It's looking to develop and to test innovative processes and technologies. And it means that the final project, which will come out of this project, is a prototype. So in EU speak, they say that we'll reach technology readiness level of 6, meaning that it's a technology that will have been tested in a relevant environment. So it won't be ready to be commercialized, but it will have taken huge steps forward in the number of processes and technologies that we've been talking about. So with that in mind, I would like to look at some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, and there's quite a few. Wazim, do you take a glass of water and then ready for the next part? So on the question and answer thing, I have a question from Marcin who asks this. He says, the multi-band multipass is looking good, but you have to have prior knowledge about the methane point source occurrences. How did you choose proper images for the analysis?
Well, this is maybe a two-part answer. For the examples in the presentation, of course, we used proxy information, and I think I've said it also in the introduction section. It's important to have proxy information that guides us into where to look. So in those cases, there is a data set called OGIM, which provides infrastructure points for oil and gas. And following those points, you can start seeing methane emissions quite more frequently than just randomly picking points. But in the case of MESEO, as I said, the outputs would be per request. So it would be a user decision to choose an area of interest, not on our side. So the user would have to be interested in an area. They could have proxy information also and request data for the area they are interested in.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to see the next ones and see if there's any that are directly connected. So we're going back a bit with one question here from Dragana, who says, you mentioned in your presentation that satellite data is available at different scales, so global, regional. What scales are you covering with the products from MESEO?
Well, for now, as we use Sentinel-2 data for the methane monitoring, both bands 12 and 11 are in 20 meter by 20 meter pixel size. Sentinel-2 is, of course, global and it could provide image globally, but the pixel itself is 20 meter by 20 meter. And in the project, we have JSAT satellite, which provides images of 2 by 2 meters in terms of spatial resolution. Those are the more or less the scales that we work with.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go back a couple of steps to nearer the beginning of your presentation. I have a question here, which is about the part where you were talking about methane emissions in general. It says you showed 2 slides with data about countries, and in the second one, it seemed that Turkmenistan ranks higher, while in the slide before it was the US. Could you give us some more information about why that was?
The guy could go also back to the slides. There is 2 different statistics here. It's the total methane emissions for oil and gas production, total by country, but while here it's the total methane emissions detected by satellite missions. And this is partly due to the fact that Turkmenistan has actually actually a pretty good area to monitor methane because of the background conditions. It's largely the area where there's a lot of oil and gas infrastructure is largely desertic area. Same for Algeria, for example. Detecting methane emissions over backgrounds like that is quite easy. So the fact that there is more detection of plumes over Turkmenistan is not surprising. While for example, for the United States, that is the largest methane emitter, the backgrounds could be quite complex, especially if we have backgrounds that have, for example, vegetation that is subject to change, and then you have a reference image that is 2-3 weeks apart from another image, then it could create a lot of background noise, and it makes it more difficult to see the methane emissions in comparison to area in Turkmenistan that has a desertic area that is quite similar, even 2 weeks apart. So it makes it that more plumes are visible in Turkmenistan, and Turkmenistan is a focus for a lot of studies in terms of methane detection.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Valentina, for the question. I hope that answered it. I have 2 questions here from Sidra. I'll start with the first one. It says, have you evaluated your model on both simulated data and Sentinel-2 data? And are there any evaluation metrics, statistics which can be shared?
Well, no, because the work on simulated data was ongoing and is going to be used to train AI models. I mean, we can detect simulated emissions over images, and we plan to use it to compare both traditional and AI methodology, but for now it's still ongoing work, so we don't have exact statistics for now to compare both models.
Okay, and the second question is again from Sidra, and it's asking about JSAT. Before I ask the question, I'd like to say that our partner from MESEO, who's the owner of JSAT, is in the chat, so they can also jump in and answer any questions if they want to. And the question says, how do you plan to use JSAT data for methane detection? If you've been given the same data as has been given to Abotica, also partner MESEO, it's not labeled data and it's mostly occluded by clouds.
As well, the plan for JSAT data is not to be used for training, because we know that we would for sure get a lot more data through a Sentinel that has a huge archive. In comparison, we probably cannot have enough data to train an AI model with JSAT data. The way we want to use it is maybe train the model on Sentinel-2 and see how it can detect data on JSAT images. They would probably not be labeled, so let's say we would choose areas of interest where we have proxy information. We know that there is a infrastructure that is emitting methane quite frequently, and we would request images over that part. So we are quite sure what we see is methane emissions, and then try an AI model that is trained on different data and see how we can see how we deal with the JSON data.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions at the moment, so perhaps I would just go back to the second part of Sidra's question, which asked about was whether any metrics and statistics could be shared. Now, our project is hoping to get feedback from stakeholders and input from other people working in this field. So while our webinars are designed, to communicate and to share information about the project, we also have active sort of means of engaging stakeholders in a sort of an iterative feedback process. We had one initial stakeholder workshop at an early stage in the project with our advisory board members, and we will be planning to hold another stakeholder workshop next year for the full sort of pre-operational demonstration. This is designed to collect feedback on the project innovations, maybe to make adaptations before arriving at the final prototype. So that is perhaps the stage where, we will also have some sort of initial data to share with people, and we'll be able to sort of gather input from yourselves as well. Wasim, does that sound about right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I don't see any more questions on the chat at the moment. Nothing on the questions and answers either. So unless anybody wants to jump in with a last minute question before I close up. Okay, then I would say that we have for now reached the end of our short webinar. We hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new. Of course, I'd like to thank Wasim for taking the time to explain this to us, and thank you all for taking part. We mentioned at the beginning that within this project we have two use cases. We will be holding another webinar. It will be on the 19th of November, and it will be looking at the other case study, which is about data for crop classification. So you'll be all invited to come along and find out how we're using the same coordination center, the same kind of data ecosystem that MESEO is putting together, but applying it to this different sector of crop classification. So as I said, that will be on the 19th of November, and you will all be invited. In the meantime, any further information about MESEO project can be found on the website, which is on the slide and also on the chat. And if any of you are interested in being updated more regularly and perhaps invited to the stakeholder workshops, you can also write an email to us, particularly to ourselves as the communication managers at meseo@resolvo.eu. And we will put you in contact with the right partners and invite you to the next steps. So I'll just write that in the chat for you so you can all see it. And with that, I'll say thanks again. Enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you all at the next MESEO webinar. Goodbye.